Hello class. Today we're going to wrap up the final unit for government this semester, and that's Unit M on state and local governments. So to that end, we'd like you to read Chapter 24 and Chapter 25. Today's brief lecture is on Chapter 24 on state governments. And we're going to specifically look at the state of Michigan Constitution and how Michigan is governed in a similar fashion to many of the other 49 states. Michigan does have a state constitution, and similar to all other states, throughout its history it has adopted 4 constitutions, beginning already even a few years before Michigan had become a state. There was a couple other attempts that you could note to write up a new constitution, but those were not ratified. And even so, in the last 10 years, there's been another attempt, briefly after the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. There was a call for a new state constitution to fix a lot of problems in the Michigan economy and to revamp the Constitution to fit modern times. However, that proposal was rejected, and there was no new Constitution written up to the point of the recording of this lecture. So the first attempt was in 1835, as you can read, 2 years before Michigan became a state. As a territory, they met in Detroit, and the Constitution was adopted by a special election in October of 1835. And again, you can read through that by clicking on the links in the PowerPoint. You can get to the historical document of the Constitution itself. It might be interesting to compare then to modern constitutions. The same with these, and you'll have some sort of activity where you can compare and contrast. So the new Constitution, again, there was 4, as I mentioned. This time in Lansing in the early 1900s, the one that was passed in 1908, there you see the capital in Lansing. The Constitution that we now exist under is the Constitution of 1963. That was, again, submitted in 1963 and has been effective ever since 1964. There has been, as I said, a few years towards the end of the Great Recession, the economic downturn that we had here, calls for another new constitution to replace the 1963 Constitution. However, that has not taken place, as I mentioned before. Therefore, the state law is continue under the current Constitution. Even though some of the things in the Constitution are obsolete, there's been an attempt to revise the Constitution. There has been several changes. One particular one, which now is interesting in light of the Supreme Court decision in the summer of 2015. Back in 2004, Michigan voters approved a constitutional change to the 1963 Constitution. And inserted in the red here, marriage was to be between one man and one woman. The voters of Michigan approved that constitutional change in 2004. However, this is now no longer in effect due to that Supreme Court decision, which is binding on all the states. The first legislature, moving on to the state legislature, which we now have sitting in Lansing. We have a two-house legislature similar to our United States legislature, if you recall that unit, a House of Representatives and a Senate. We also in Michigan, sitting in Lansing, is a Senate and a House of Representatives. 16 senators and 50 representatives met first in Detroit, which was our capital till 1847. Today we have 148 members of the representatives and 38 senators meeting in Lansing, representing the various districts of Michigan. And you can find a district map. Some of the ones at the time of this recording, the 28th, 9th, and 30th Michigan districts are probably where most of you live. And again, you could pull up a map of the Michigan legislature districts. Again, it can get quite confusing because there's also United States representative districts. And then there's districts that represent you in Lansing. So it's important to keep those ideas separate. The Michigan House of Representatives, the House is represented by, each House member represents around 70 to 90,000 people in their area, and they serve also a 2-year term similar to that of the United States House of Representatives. Again, these are somewhat dated because Justin Amash has no longer represents us in Michigan. He now sits in the United States House of Representatives. So you would want to click on the link here and get the updated because it does change from time to time. Similar to the United States, there's also chief executive. In the state, it's called a governor. For many years, we had one Jennifer Granholm. Then, more recently, we've had one Rick Snyder, who was the 48th governor of Michigan and took office in January of 2011. Other important executives are the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. These in Michigan are elected positions, not appointed as in the case of the United States. Also, the role of the Secretary of State is quite different at the level of Michigan than the Secretary of State would be for the United States government. I think you're probably somewhat familiar with what the Secretary of State does and also the Attorney General, but you could read also more carefully on your state's website as you conduct your research into the work of these important administrators. There are also several court systems in Michigan. Michigan itself has a Supreme Court to decide issues for the state of Michigan. The Supreme Court of Michigan sits and hears these cases. Every 2 years, the justices elect a member of the court as the Chief Justice. Under the Supreme Court, you have district courts, the 59th District in Granville, the 58th in Ottawa County, and the 63rd District would cover the rest of our area of where our students come from. These district courts, of course, could cover civil lawsuits, traffic violations, landlord-tenant issues, small claims, and so on. Maybe you've had a chance to appear in one of these districts or even a smaller court, such as in the city of Walker or some other thing to argue a traffic ticket. So all these different cases of $25,000 or less could be heard in these. Also, the circuit courts can hear appeals from the lower courts and those in those circuits. The probate courts, again, you don't need to worry as much about, but those cover probate issues. You can read about those in your book as well, and we'll get a chance to look up on the local websites how some of these courts impact us today.